General Hospital spoilers reveal that Kai's arrival in Port Charles was once seen as a fresh spark in a city drowning in secrets, scandals, and betrayals. As a rising football star with charisma, grit, and an infectious smile, Kai brought a rare kind of optimism to the screen, one that made viewers believe he could transcend the shadow of his predecessors. When Trina fell for him, fans rooted for them. She had suffered heartbreak, and he offered her a different kind of love, one not mired in legacy, blood feuds, or decades of pain. But like many who come to Port Charles with dreams, Kai's path was slowly but steadily warped by forces stronger than he ever anticipated. And now, with his reputation unraveling, his relationships in ruins, and his sense of identity vanishing by the day, Kai finds himself slipping into a spiral that may lead him straight out of town, both literally and figuratively. What began as a promising redemption arc has turned into a slow descent into self-destruction. Kai was never supposed to be the villain. He was meant to be the breath of fresh air. The hopeful athlete who had it all, until he lost it in a flash. The injury that ended his football career did more than tear at his muscles, it fractured the very foundation of who he believed he was. The field was his sanctuary, the roar of the crowd his validation. Without the sport, Kai no longer knew how to define himself. And when Drew stepped in, offering a new path, one paved with false promises and whispers of reinvention, Kai, desperate and disoriented, took it. The surgery Drew paid for was supposed to be the beginning of a comeback. Kai didn't want to be forgotten, and more than that, he didn't want to feel useless. He told himself it was about healing, about standing tall again, not just physically, but emotionally, socially, even romantically. But deep down, it was about control. The surgery was a shortcut to reclaiming agency, and in trusting Drew, Kai unknowingly handed over the reins of his own narrative. And it was fear, a dangerous cocktail that clouded Kai's judgment. When the surgery failed to restore him, Kai didn't retreat. He doubled down. He defended Drew. Even as the man's ties to controversial figures and political manipulation became impossible to ignore. And worse, Kai began turning his back on the people who once gave him hope. He distanced himself from Trina, not out of cruelty, but because he knew she saw through him. Her presence was a mirror to his deterioration. He couldn't face her because she represented who he used to be, the version of Kai who believed in decency, loyalty, and honest love. Instead of confronting his shame, he sought comfort in denial. In secrets, and in the illusion that he could still matter by playing a different game, the game of influence, favors, and quiet sabotage. It was in this fog of denial that Kai made his gravest mistake. He shared confidential information about Curtis and Portia, information Trina never would have forgiven him for leaking. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't smart. It was an impulsive betrayal driven by misplaced allegiance. Drew had become his lifeline, and Kai, clinging to the only person who still gave him a sense of purpose, sold out the people who once cared about him unconditionally. It wasn't just a breach of trust. It was a declaration that Kai no longer stood for the values he once claimed to hold dear. When Trina found out, she didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply walked away. That silence was deafening. It was the sound of finality, the echo of a door closing that Kai could never force open again. Her departure left him stranded, not just romantically, but existentially. Who was he now? Not an athlete. Not a lover. Not a friend. Just a pawn in Drew's convoluted schemes, a face fading from relevance in a town that no longer had room for him. And yet, Kai still showed up. He came to the party that was never meant to be a wedding, sat among guests who barely acknowledged him, and remained unbothered by the mounting tension surrounding Drew. In fact, he offered Drew a ride home, an act that didn't go unnoticed. It wasn't compassion. It was complicity. And for those watching, it was confirmation that Kai had chosen his side. And it wasn't the right one. The consequences of that choice are now materializing in full force. Whispers are growing louder. People are beginning to question whether Kai ever belonged in Port Charles to begin with. His connections are dissolving. His storylines are shrinking. He no longer fits into the central tapestry of the town's drama, and even worse, he's become an extension of a man the entire community is turning against. Every action he takes, every word he defends Drew with, is pushing him further out of the frame. Now, as Drew's own world begins to implode, political fallout, legal troubles, and personal betrayals, Kai is being dragged down with him. Not because Drew is malicious, but because Kai tethered his fate to someone who never truly cared about his well-being. Drew saw in Kai a tool, a symbol, a temporary vessel through which he could manipulate the optics of his reputation. When the illusion fades, Drew will discard Kai without hesitation. And Kai, who once had the world at his feet, will be left with nothing but regret and a one-way ticket out of town. Port Charles is unforgiving to those who fall out of favor. It's a town that thrives on legacy, loyalty, and redemption. But redemption requires self-awareness, humility, and the courage to atone. Kai hasn't shown any of those things, not yet. He still walks around like the town owes him understanding, like the betrayal wasn't that serious, like Trina should have waited longer. But time is a luxury in a town always racing toward its next crisis, and Kai missed his chance. There's talk now, real talk, of Kai leaving Port Charles altogether. Washington, D.C. is being whispered as a landing spot. A place where Drew's influence might still hold weight. A place where Kai could disappear without fanfare. The townspeople won't fight to keep him. Curtis won't vouch for him. Portia won't forgive him. Trina certainly won't follow. It's not an exile in name, but in every practical sense, it is. His story is no longer entwined with theirs. His presence is more disruption than contribution. And so, the question lingers, not whether Kai should leave, but why he stayed this long. He was given every chance. He had love, opportunity, and a path to healing. But in choosing ego over empathy, secrecy over sincerity, and Drew over decency, Kai burned the bridges that could have saved him. Maybe one day he'll return, wiser, humbled, ready to face the town he turned his back on. But for now, Port Charles is done with Kai. And whether he realizes it or not, Kai is done with Port Charles too. His arc has curved toward departure. His relevance drained by his own choices. And as he steps into the unknown, one truth remains: Port Charles moves on quickly. It always has. It always will. Kai was no longer just reacting to the fallout, he was living inside it. Every breath he took, every glance cast his way, reminded him of how far he had drifted from who he used to be. The changes weren't sudden, but they were unrelenting, like waves wearing down stone. Something was shifting inside him, and that shift, subtle at first, had now consumed his entire identity. What had once been a journey of resilience was now a surrender to something darker, heavier, more permanent. He was not the same Kai who first walked into Port Charles with fire in his veins and hope in his eyes. He was not the same Kai who stood on the field, arms wide to the roar of the crowd. That Kai was gone. In his place was a man unraveling under the weight of forces he could no longer name, trying to convince himself that he still had control. But he didn't. The truth was that Kai was facing the most dangerous kind of transformation, the kind that strips away not just dreams, but conviction. The recent changes in his life, the failed surgery, Trina's rejection, the public shame of aligning with Drew, were more than a sequence of events. They were symptoms of something deeper. Something irreversible. A psychological shift that had begun as quiet doubt and matured into obsession. Obsession with mattering. Obsession with power. Obsession with relevance. And now that obsession was eating through every part of him like acid. He couldn't name exactly when the fear had first taken hold. Maybe it was the moment the doctor told him he would never play again. Maybe it was when Trina looked at him not with love, but with disappointment. Or maybe it was when he realized that no matter how far he reached, the glory he once had was never coming back. But whatever the origin, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was changing. And not for the better. At first, he thought he was adjusting, making the necessary tweaks to survive. He told himself that working with Drew was temporary. That spying on Curtis and Portia was strategic. That defending Drew at the party was just about loyalty. But deep down, he knew the truth. These weren't adjustments. These were sacrifices. And each one chipped away at his soul until he didn't even flinch when he betrayed someone. Until he didn't recognize the voice in his head that kept whispering, "Do it, there's no going back now." Kai told himself that it was all part of a bigger plan. That he was becoming smarter, tougher, less naive. But in reality, he was spiraling into a different kind of madness, one rooted in obsession with proving everyone wrong. And as he kept adjusting, kept compromising, kept digging deeper into Drew's world, he realized he was no longer trying to reclaim his old self. He was trying to erase him entirely. The changes happening inside Kai weren't just emotional, they were behavioral, neurological, instinctual. He began isolating himself, speaking less, trusting no one. He began questioning every glance from people in town, every silence, every whisper. He was sure they were talking about him, judging him, laughing. And maybe they were, but not in the way he thought. They weren't mocking him because he failed as an athlete. They pitied him because he failed as a human being. Because he traded love for lies. Purpose for performance. Community for conspiracy. Trina had once said that Kai was her second chance at something real. And now, she wouldn't even say his name. Her silence haunted him more than any confrontation ever could. He replayed her walking away over and over again, trying to find the moment where he could have said something, done something, to stop her. But there was nothing. Because she had seen the truth in his eyes, the obsession. The addiction to being right. The refusal to feel remorse. And in that moment, she saw someone not worth saving. Still, Kai kept trying to pretend the changes were empowering him. He threw himself deeper into Drew's political network. He memorized talking points. Schmoozed with lobbyists, nodded at strategy meetings like he understood. But inside, he was hollow. The truth was, he didn't care about policy. He didn't care about causes. He only cared about being seen. Being needed. Being indispensable. Because if he wasn't, then who was he? That need, the burning obsession to be someone again, was becoming all-consuming. Kai wasn't just adjusting anymore. He was dissolving into the persona he had created. The helpful aide. The strategic mind. The new face of redemption. But it wasn't real. None of it was. Because every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the fear. The loss. The boy who just wanted to matter. And that boy was screaming inside the man who refused to listen. Curtis confronted him one night, asking why he had leaked the information. Why he had turned on them. Kai tried to justify it, said it wasn't personal, that he was just trying to protect his future. But Curtis didn't buy it. He saw through him. Called it what it was, cowardice. And in that moment, something broke. Kai wanted to shout back, to defend himself, but he couldn't. Because deep down, he agreed. He had become obsessed with change, any change, because the status quo meant accepting that he had failed. That his glory days were behind him. That Trina was never coming back. That Port Charles had moved on. And the more he tried to fight that truth, the more he became its embodiment. A man desperately running from stillness, chasing chaos like a lifeline. Now, as Drew's empire begins to crumble under federal scrutiny and political backlash, Kai sees the end coming. Not just for Drew, but for himself. Because when Drew falls, there will be no one left to shield Kai from the consequences of what he's done. And even if he avoids legal trouble, he won't avoid the shame. The permanent stain of having lost himself in someone else's war. The whispers about Kai's departure are no longer rumors. They are reality. Contracts unsigned. Projects quietly handed to others. Meetings cancelled without explanation. Even Drew, once so eager to use Kai's loyalty, has grown distant, focused on his own survival. Kai is no longer useful. And when usefulness is gone, so is value. What remains is a man standing on the edge of a city that has turned its back on him. A man who once lit up a football stadium, now reduced to wandering side streets and avoiding eye contact. A man who once had Trina's laughter, now haunted by the sound of her silence. A man who thought adjusting meant growing, when really it meant surrendering to everything he swore he would never become. Kai is facing the final adjustment now, leaving. And perhaps, in some twisted way, it is the only real step forward left to him. Because staying would mean continuing the performance. Leaving might finally allow him to sit with the grief. To mourn the loss of who he was. To ask the questions he's been too afraid to face. Is he gone for good? Port Charles has a way of resurrecting the fallen, if they are willing to change. But Kai must first survive the collapse of everything he clung to. He must sit alone with his obsessions. He must dismantle the lies. And only then, maybe, will there be something left to rebuild. For now, though, the path is clear. The city is ready to exhale in his absence. The people who once cheered for him have turned the page. And Kai, the man who adjusted too far, who chased reinvention into ruin, will walk away not as a hero, not as a villain. But as a cautionary tale, a story about what happens when the obsession to matter becomes louder than the voice of conscience. Just when it seemed the tension surrounding Kai had reached its peak, everything took a darker turn. Port Charles was already brimming with unease, the fallout from secrets, betrayals, and political agendas had left cracks running through every corner of the city. But now, with Kai drifting in the eye of the storm, Drew handed him a new mission. And with it came an adjustment so dangerous, so fundamentally altering, that it would push Kai further from redemption than ever before. This was no longer about survival. It was about ignition. The spark that Drew lit beneath Kai's fractured soul was about to set off an emotional explosion that no one in Port Charles would be able to contain. Drew summoned him late, past midnight. Under the pretense of urgency. Kai arrived hollow-eyed and silent, but alert, like someone walking through a dream he couldn't wake up from. The room was quiet, dark. Clinical. Nothing like the fiery speeches Drew once gave in political halls. This was personal. Strategic. Paranoid. And when Drew finally spoke, he didn't mince words. He wanted leverage, on someone powerful. Someone who had enough influence to threaten his position and possibly undo everything he had built. Drew didn't name names, not at first. But Kai knew. The pieces were obvious. Curtis, or worse, Anna. Port Charles's power brokers. What Drew asked wasn't simple surveillance. It was infiltration. Exploitation. Sabotage. He wanted Kai to worm his way into trust, to manipulate, to extract. To twist relationships into bargaining chips. It was the kind of mission that required complete moral detachment, something Kai, once upon a time, would have recoiled from. But now? Kai didn't flinch. Not because he agreed. But because he didn't feel anything at all. This was the clearest sign yet that the transformation within Kai had completed its next phase. He wasn't the same. Not even close. He used to push back. He used to ask questions. But now, he accepted the assignment like a soldier too numb to consider consequence. Something in him believed this was his only path. That if he completed this mission, if he delivered, maybe Drew would see him as more than a tool. Maybe Port Charles would finally see him as irreplaceable. Maybe Trina would see him again. But deep inside, Kai knew he was lying to himself. This wasn't about earning anything. This was about holding on to the last flickers of identity. The mission was proof that he still mattered. Even if what he did was morally bankrupt, even if it cost people their trust, their careers, their reputations, at least he wouldn't disappear. At least his name would still be spoken. As he left Drew's office that night, the city felt different. Not because the streets had changed, but because Kai's mind had. He looked around and no longer saw friends or enemies. He saw variables. Access points. Emotional weaknesses he could exploit. Curtis's sense of honor. Portia's need for control. Anna's guilt. Jocelyn's grief. He saw it all with clinical detachment. The fire that once burned in him, the desire to be someone of value, had turned to cold calculation. And it terrified even him. In the days that followed, Kai played the part well. He reached out to old acquaintances under the guise of reconciliation. He offered help at the hospital. Made small talk with Trina's friends. Even stopped by Curtis's foundation and praised their community work. But behind his calm smile was a ticking clock. Every gesture was a data point. Every smile a manipulation. He was building a map of emotional leverage, brick by brick. And no one saw it coming. No one suspected the depth of his new alignment with Drew. But pressure was building. And his reflection was a stranger. Yet still, he kept going, because stopping meant facing the gaping void where his soul used to live. He convinced himself that as long as he had a role to play, a mission to complete, he wasn't lost. But the truth was, he was already gone. One evening, while eavesdropping in a restricted wing of the hospital, Kai overheard something he wasn't supposed to, something that made even him freeze. It wasn't a threat against Drew. It was a plan being formed against Kai. People were starting to notice the changes. They were connecting dots. Curtis had grown distant and suspicious. Portia was making quiet inquiries. Even Elizabeth had confided to someone that Kai doesn't look right anymore. And worst of all, someone had told Trina. Kai knew that once Trina truly believed he had betrayed not only her trust but her community's, there would be no salvaging anything. No slow repair. No redemption arc. Only erasure. His last shred of hope, however distorted, would evaporate. But instead of turning back, Kai pushed forward. With urgency. Desperation. Fury. His obsession was now completely unbound. He wasn't doing this for Drew anymore. He wasn't even doing it for himself. He was doing it because it was all he had left. The mission became an identity. The sabotage became his only form of communication with a world that no longer listened. Then the explosion came, not literal, but emotional, societal, communal. Information leaked. Private conversations made public. Political alliances shattered. Reputations bled under scrutiny. No one knew where the leak came from, but those close enough to see the pattern knew. Drew's enemies began to close in. And Kai was suddenly the man in the middle, caught between a crumbling empire and a town ready to expel him. Curtis confronted him first. It wasn't an interrogation. It was a funeral, for trust, for hope, for the boy they once thought could be better. Then Portia. Then Jocelyn. Even Anna. One by one, they looked at Kai not with anger, but pity. And that pity hurt more than hate ever could. When Trina finally spoke, she didn't yell. She simply said, "You've become someone I don't recognize." And that was the final blow. Because recognition was all he ever wanted. To be seen. To be understood. To matter. And now, even the person who once saw him fully, saw nothing. Drew offered him escape. A quiet departure.